Just check that that screws tight, check that that works, that's running smoothly. If I collapse the front of the camera, I'm just making sure that my shaft pops up through there. That closes nicely, that's good. Now here we're going to want the coupling gear for the transfer shaft there. We can put that in place now. Normally I put a wipe of synthetic grease on the inside, some on the outside where it runs through the body. Drop that into place over there. The front of that gear, just put a touch on there so that it'll run smoothly in the front guide bush, which is here. Get in there, you bugger. That's better. And there are two small screws that hold that in position. The screws are chrome plated, easily scratched. It's not uncommon to have one ugly screw at least from someone having slipped with a screwdriver. The one at the top here you can see easily. Make sure that's the pretty screw if you've got an ugly one. And the uglier one you can put down the bottom here, which is completely out of sight, and no one will notice if that one's not as pretty as it should be. So I've got that in position, tighten the two screws, and that's my gear here coupled through to the pinion at the back there. Now the front opens and closes smoothly. That's good. At the base of the camera, now I won't do that. I'll do the top of the camera first. I'm going to do the rewind for a good reason. So the inner part of the rewind shaft has a little spring on it, a detent, which applies a little bit of friction to it so that it doesn't flop around. It's got a tab on here which lines up with a slot in the outer shaft. That's good, that's all fitted nicely. And here I'm using the synthetic grease again. You could use graphite grease in a position like this without any problem. And I'm assembling the shaft to the bush here. Now, rather than just forcing the shaft into the bush, I'm just going to lift the tail of that spring up slightly to clear the shaft and just check that it runs in smoothly. That's all good. And the rewind fits on here. Two countersunk head screws, same size as the ones that we used to hold the shroud into the body, but in this case they will not be covered in glue, corrosion, and they haven't been mutilated by being over tightened. So they're usually prettier screws. Just do those two screws up tight. That's good. Now, this is the reason I wanted to do that job first. I need to loop a rubber band between here and the shutter release so the shutter release shaft doesn't fall out, because I don't want it falling out and letting that piece down, that coupling thing, get away. So I need a rubber band. Here I have it. I'll just stretch that over there. That's all that's needed. It's just enough to stop this thing from falling out. If it falls out, it causes you bother and a nuisance. At the base of the camera, we have this little piece here, which is the guide for the film cassettes. That sits into that recess. The tripod socket sits over the top of it, and there are 3 screws. Usually easily recognised. They're longer than the ones we've been dealing with. They also tend to have corrosion on the heads because they're at the base of the camera and they've probably been sitting somewhere damp at some stage. Run those 3 screws in, get them started. Once they're all fully in position, tighten the 3 up. Should make sure they're reasonably tight. That's it. Now when I put the camera down on the bench, I'm not striking the release button for the back, and the back of the camera is not flying open every 5 seconds. Okay, so far so good. What's next in the bag of tricks? Well, here I've got the lock lever and the release lever. And the film, that can go back in with another thing. Right, so lock levers and release levers. First, lubrication. I take some molybdenum paste, run it into those 3 holes at the bottom there. At the front there where you see that black paint mark, which is neither here nor there, that's where the spring is going to run against that, so I run some against that surface. At the top of the camera, 2 holes here where those shafts will come through, and you just need to run a little bit of molybdenum paste on there like that. You could use another lubricant, there wouldn't be a particular problem using anything else. The molybdenum has the advantage that basically it's a dryish paste. It's not going to gather up dust and cause a sticking problem at a later date. So I've got to get the return spring on the lock lever for a start, so making sure that's up to the top of its stroke. Put on the spring. There are 2 springs that look much the same. The shorter spring goes on the lock lever, the longer spring goes on the release lever. Just making sure I've got this setting down. So I've stretched that, pushed that spring down, compressed it so that I've got room to slide the little clip in here. Little E clip or C clip. It slides in there and retains that spring. Just checking the action of that, that's good. Bit of fluff there, we can do without that. The release lever. The release lever has a little spring on the bottom of it. And getting this spring back in place is slightly more awkward than it was to remove the spring. Yeah, that's it. That's the spring back on the lever. And the lever goes in here, that front hole. Watch this spring, it's delicate, it's easily damaged if it catches on the edge of the body and you press this down. Guide that post up through the body, make sure that that's all tucked away. I'm holding this, I'm supporting it with my finger from underneath. The second of those 2 springs, this is the longer spring and it's a slightly heavier spring. And the screw that runs in the top there, and get that screw started on the shaft. Of course that's always typically a bit awkward. You're trying to get it to start in a split shaft. It's a tight fit, because it needs to be a tight fit because it allows for adjustment. I'll just screw that down a little bit more than that. I know that when my shutter releases at the top of its stroke, it should clear that screw head. That'll do. That's that part. Next, film advance. So here I've got the film advance shaft, and I want to lubricate this. I'm using graphite grease here because I like the way this particular grease feels in this application. It's quite good at sticking to surfaces. It's quite good in a high friction area like this. So I'm applying some there, top and bottom of that bush, and just check that revolve the bush around on the shaft to make sure that that's spread evenly. That feels good. And I'll rub a little bit of grease into that spring so that the coil tightens and releases smoothly. Here's the take-up spool. Now the plain round hole goes to the bottom. The one with the slot across it is at the top of the camera. Our bush goes into the plain brown round hole at the bottom. And that goes into the back of the camera in here. Our shutter, our take-up film advance shaft can now go in. And I need to align this correctly. Okay, so I've got the cam correctly aligned here with my two levers, but the shaft, the bush, is rotated slightly from where I want it to be, so I've got to see where it's gone, which direction it's gone in. Need to expose those screw holes. There we go. 3 screws. Hold that bush to the base plate of the camera. Make sure you get them all in first and that they're all correctly positioned, then tighten them up. That's that. That's all in position. Next task, the clutch. The clutch assembly. Well, the clutch assembly is what allows for controlled slippage between the sprocket and the take-up spool. If you didn't have any controlled slippage, you'd end up tearing film. I need to find something. The clutch, again, I lubricate with graphite grease. So I'm running some graphite grease into the outside component of the clutch. This is messy stuff. Now the inside component, here's the inside component here, and here's the spring that couples them. Now the spring has a small tab at the top which couples into that notch. Now getting my pliers on here, I've got a pair of crimp lug pliers that are just the job for this. I've rotated that into position and I can fit my outer part of the clutch over the top, and I'm checking the feel of that, and it moves much smoother in one direction than the other, and as luck would have it, the smooth direction is of course the correct direction. I wipe in the centre of the clutch with a bit of synthetic grease. Drop that over the shaft on the film advance, rotate it so it engages with the take-up spool, and so I rotate the take-up spool, you'll see that that's turning with it. The guide bush for our top of our film advance shaft needs to go on now. Now, having been through all the cleaning process, there's not much grease left in here, so I'm just going to force a bit of grease into that little pinion set there. Quick wipe on the inside where the shaft runs through it and fit that into place. And if I rotate the sprocket, the take-up spool, while I'm doing that, that should drop down over the top without any problem. It did. And that's held in place with two screws. One is a tall screw with a shoulder on it that supports the shutter cocking rack. On the other side we have four components. Starts with a little bush. That bush is countersunk on one side, plain on the other. Plain side should be up. There's a little ratchet pawl that sits on top of that bush, and on top of that goes the screw, and I'm just putting a touch of grease under the head of that screw where it runs through that ratchet pawl. Drop that into position, run that screw down, make sure that it runs through the little pawl and it isn't jamming anything. That feels good. Tighten that screw up, and there's a spring that fits on that pawl, and here it is. So that needs to be manipulated into that space. Here I'm just using a toothpick and a pair of tweezers to manipulate that spring into position. It's almost there. That's it. So that pawl has got a little bit of spring tension on it. It needs hardly any spring tension, but that prevents the gear from being able to run backwards. I'm running through my components here now. What's next? Right, this little piece here, we're right into the Film Advanced stuff now. I'm just going to cheat here because otherwise I'm going to get in trouble. At the base of the camera, this lever is inclined to fall out of place when you've got nothing supporting it. So what I normally do is put a tripod bush on the table, sit the camera over the top of it. It just supports that shaft so it's not falling away while I'm trying to work on the camera. This gear, I normally run a little smear of grease around the underside edge of that and through the centre. Rotate that into position counterclockwise. It just pushes the pawl out of the way as you do it, and I normally just line that up so it's lined up at the front. This spring, this flat spring piece here, I give that a wipe of grease, not because it needs to be lubricated to do its job. I do it because it is a high carbon steel and it's prone to corrosion if you don't have anything on it. And of course it's exceptionally clean at the moment because it's been through the cleaning process. So I will just put these other components in place. We're right up to the gear stage now. That's the gear on the top of the Film Advanced shaft. It needs to fit over that squared off piece there, and that is held in place with the screw. And of course I can see everything I want except the screwdriver I need. See if I can turn this into a pair of tweezers, and if I can't I'll go and find the right tool. That's it, it's started. Let's just rotate that down. Okay, now because the shaft here at the bottom is locked because our lock lever has dropped into position, as it would do at the end of the film, it means that the shaft's held from turning, and so it means that I can put a screwdriver on the top of that screw, tighten it up, and it'll be easy to tighten. So I'll find the screwdriver. And here it is. That's all that was required. That's our Film Advance shaft back in the camera. And next I want to put the catch for the what do I call this piece? Oh yes, this is the rewind button. The rewind button lever here. Its job is to hold the rewind button in the depressed position once you've pressed the button in, until such stage as you hit the Film Advance again. Otherwise you would have to hold the rewind button down the entire time you were winding the film and back into the camera, which is something that was actually not uncommon amongst old cameras. Right, so that's in position. I'll put its spring in position, and I'll put its screw in position. That's a shoulder screw. The screw has two shoulders on it, one that the lever revolves around and one that the spring can revolve around. And everything here is magnetic and it's causing me grief. Hang on, that springs at the screw looks like it might be magnetised. It's interesting. Let's try a different screwdriver. Right, I've got the screw started. Make sure that the lever moves and that the spring moves freely, and I can tighten that screw up. And I need to swing the end of that spring over so that it's engaged behind this part of the lever and is swinging that lever in the correct position, correct direction. To do that, it's one of those jobs that really you'd need 3 tweezers for, but you can do it with one if you hold your mouth right. Okay, that's in position. Next, our film sprocket and the sprocket shaft. So the sprocket shaft, lubricate that, the bottom sort of 8 millimeters or so, much the same at the top on that shaft. Typically I'll put a wipe just on that little gear at the top for good measure. This goes up one way. It's got a slot in there that goes towards the top. Feed the shaft in from the top, pass it through the sprocket. You may need to use a pair of tweezers to line that up with the hole at the bottom. I'm supporting that shaft with my finger from below. Pull that tab back, it allows this to come right through. I want to put the screw in place that holds this in and drives it, holds these two sections together. And I'll find that screw because I didn't previously have it ready to go. On the 3C, it's the same as the 2 screws used for doing the hinges for the front door. On a Retina IIa type camera, it's a different size screw. That's that screw done up. That means that shaft can't get away now. The rewind button itself, I want to put some synthetic grease on the return spring for the rewind button. Pass the rewind button through the spring through its washer. Now I was holding that shaft down on the top of the camera with my finger. I can screw this into position. That's good. And as luck would have it, I do have the correct pair of pliers with me. So if I hold the sprocket firmly, I can rotate that with my pliers to tighten that button, and the rewind button is now in place. It's clicked down in position. If you move the film advance, it would swing that lever across and allows the rewind button to pop back up. So our film advance is fairly well advanced. And I can turn my attention to the top of the camera again now. Right, I'm going to fit the film advance lever temporarily. Now what I want to do here is wind one full turn of tension on that film advance shaft there, so that it's pre-tensioned, and so that the film advance lever returns to the park position correctly. So first I'm just pushed down my lock lever and swung it to one side so it's not fouling anything. I will lift my release lever with a pair of tweezers, rotate my film advance shaft clockwise one full turn, drop the lock lever back in place to hold it in position, and that is sitting correctly in position for the film advance. That's the beginning of the film advance stroke. So if I put my 3 screws through the base of this now, that will hold that lever in place. Not there. Haven't got that lined up correctly. That's better. 2 screws will suffice for this at this time. Alright, so now if I swing my film advance lever, let's just lift that up, hold down the lock lever, swing my film advance lever. Does it complete the stroke? Yes, it does. Press that button down, that releases it. Oh, that's better. That appears to be working fine. I'll put the shutter cocking rack in place next.